5:47 a.m., June 3rd, 2026, Tampa, Florida. 14 federal vehicles moved through the pre-dawn streets of Hillsborough County in 3 separate columns. No sirens, no radio chatter above a whisper. Each column had a destination. Each destination had a name. Total estimated value of naval intelligence compromised, $4, $7 million, paid out over 11 months. Enough to reposition Iranian patrol behavior across the Strait of Hormuz before U.S. Navy vessels had cleared their own transit windows. The drivers didn't need GPS. They'd run the routes twice the previous week during dry rehearsals. Every traffic light, every turn radius, every neighbor's dog that might bark at the wrong moment. Mapped, noted, accounted for. At 5:47 a.m., all 3 columns were 60 seconds out. What no one outside the operation knew, and what the 3 men sleeping in their Tampa Bay area homes had no idea was coming, was that the arrest warrants had been ready for 9 days. The delay wasn't procedure. It was deliberate. Investigators needed one more confirmation, a final wire transfer, one last piece of evidence that would make the case airtight under the Espionage Act. That transfer had cleared on June 1st. 48 hours later, the columns moved. This is the story of how 3 mid-level defense subcontractors with active secret clearances, clean performance reviews, and season tickets to Raymond James Stadium spent 11 months selling U.S. Navy movement data to an Iranian-linked intelligence network, and how a single anomaly in a classified repositioning order, noticed by one NCIS analyst sitting alone at a desk in Norfolk, unraveled everything. The first name on the arrest warrant was Daniel Carver, 41 years old, subcontractor for a defense logistics firm operating under a support services agreement at MacDill Air Force Base, Tampa. His official role, scheduling coordinator for fuel and maintenance support contracts tied to Naval Surface Forces Atlantic. In practice, that meant Carver had routine access to vessel transit schedules, the kind of data that told you not just where a ship was, but when it would need to stop, when its systems would be offline for maintenance, and which transit corridors it would use through contested waters. His performance reviews for 3 consecutive years described him as meticulous, detail-oriented, and a low-maintenance asset to the contract team. No prior criminal record. No red flags on his last 2 background investigations. He'd renewed his secret clearance in March 2024 without incident. He also had $218,000 in cash sitting inside a rented boat storage unit in Riverview, Florida, 22 miles from his front door. The second name was Marcus Prewitt, 38. A systems integration analyst contracted through the same parent firm, with access to the same scheduling infrastructure as Carver. Where Carver handled fuel and maintenance logistics, Prewitt's access touched vessel repositioning orders, the classified notifications that moved Navy ships out of published patrol patterns and into new assignments. These were among the most sensitive data points in the entire logistics pipeline, distributed on a strict need-to-know basis. 14 people at MacDill received them. Prewitt was one of the 14. The third name was Elena Vasquez, 44. Senior contract administrator, the longest tenured of the 3, with 8 years on the MacDill support contract. Her access was broader than the other 2. She had read access to combined operational summaries that aggregated fuel schedules, maintenance windows, and repositioning orders into single documents designed to give contract managers a complete picture of upcoming naval activity for planning purposes. What made those summaries useful for contract planning also made them extraordinarily valuable to anyone trying to anticipate U.S. naval movement in a contested theater. 3 people, 3 access profiles. Together, they formed something close to a complete picture of Navy logistics in the Atlantic and Gulf approaches. Everything a foreign intelligence service would need to track, anticipate, and exploit U.S. vessel movement in the Strait of Hormuz during one of the most volatile naval standoffs in years. The operation that would eventually expose them began not in Tampa, but in Norfolk, Virginia. October 14th, 2025. NCIS counterintelligence analyst Sandra Yee had been working a routine access log audit when she pulled the distribution record for a classified repositioning order issued on October 9th. The order had moved a destroyer out of its published patrol corridor and into a staging position near the strait approaches, a minor adjustment in the larger scheme of the Hormuz standoff, one of dozens of similar orders issued that month. Standard procedure. What wasn't standard was what happened 72 hours later. Iranian naval patrol vessels in the Gulf had adjusted their own positioning in a pattern that, to a trained counterintelligence eye, mirrored the U.S. vessel's new corridor. The adjustment was subtle. It could have been coincidence. It could have been independent Iranian surveillance picking up the movement through their own channels. Yi flagged it anyway. She cross-referenced the repositioning order's distribution list, 14 recipients, against the timing of the Iranian patrol adjustment. Then she pulled financial surveillance data. FinCEN had been running pattern analysis on wire transfers connected to known Iranian-linked intermediary accounts as part of a broader sanctions monitoring program. 3 names on the distribution list showed financial activity that warranted a second look. 2 of those 3 names resolved to dead ends within 48 hours. Legitimate transactions. Business activity consistent with their professional profiles. The 3rd name was Marcus Prewitt. The wire in question was $47,000, routed through a Latvian intermediary bank. Meridian Capital Services, registered in Riga, to a personal account Prewitt held under a business name he'd registered in 2023, Prewitt Technical Consulting, LLC. The sender was a Dubai-registered firm called Nexus Advisory Group. On paper, the transaction was labeled Technical Advisory Services Rendered. Nexus Advisory Group had been incorporated in the Dubai International Financial Center 14 months earlier. Its listed director was a Bahraini national named Farouk al-Rashid. Nexus had no public client list, no verifiable track record, and no web presence beyond a single-page registration filing. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control had flagged al-Rashid's name in a 2024 sanctions review as a suspected financial intermediary for an Iranian intelligence-linked procurement network operating through Gulf-registered shell companies. The flag hadn't resulted in a formal designation. Insufficient evidence at the time, but the connection was documented. 1 wire, 1 intermediary, 1 name on a sanctions watch list. Yi brought the analysis to her supervisor at NCIS Counterintelligence on October 17th. By October 21st, the case had been referred jointly to FBI's Tampa field office and NCIS Special Operations. The joint investigation that followed would run for 7.5 months. Going through the early case file documentation, one detail kept nagging at me. The investigators knew almost immediately that a single wire transfer wasn't going to be enough. Not for Espionage Act charges. Not against defendants with clean records and active clearances. They needed pattern. They needed communications. They needed the defendants talking to the network on the record. That meant going undercover. The decision to run an undercover operation rather than move immediately to surveillance and arrest wasn't made lightly. The risk was straightforward. If the network sensed any disruption, a sudden change in the data it was receiving, an unexplained gap in the intelligence pipeline, it would go dark. The Tampa cell would sanitize. Al-Rashid would dissolve Nexus Advisory Group. The Latvian intermediary accounts would close. And the case, built on one analyst's anomaly flag and a single wire transfer, would collapse. The alternative was to let the scheme continue running while investigators built the evidentiary case from inside it. FBI's Tampa field office identified a candidate for the undercover role within 2 weeks. Special Agent Kevin Marsh, 11 years in the Bureau, 4 of them working counterintelligence operations with specific experience in defense contractor environments. Marsh's cover identity was constructed over 6 weeks. On paper, he became Kevin Marsh, a defense logistics subcontractor with a background in naval supply chain management, currently unaffiliated and looking for contract work in the Tampa Bay area. The introduction to Carver came through a mutual contact in the local defense contractor community. A legitimate professional who had no knowledge of the investigation and whose connection to Carver was entirely social. On December 3rd, 2025, Marsh met Carver at a sports bar in Ybor City during a Buccaneers watch party. The conversation that evening was unremarkable. Football. Work complaints. The usual texture of 2 contractors griping about government bureaucracy over beer. Marsh mentioned, offhandedly, that he was looking to pick up some consulting work while he waited on a new contract vehicle to come through. Carver mentioned he might know some people. 3 weeks later, Carver called Marsh's cover number. What happened between that first phone call and the arrests 5 months later was a methodical accumulation of evidence. Calls recorded, meetings documented, digital transfers flagged, communications mapped. But the path wasn't straight, and the obstacles weren't minor. The first serious complication came in January 2026, and it nearly ended the operation before it reached critical mass. Prewitt went dark. For 19 days in January, Prewitt made no contact with the Nexus network, no outgoing encrypted messages, no wire transfers, no communication with Carver or Vasquez that surveillance could detect. The silence was complete. Investigators developed 2 theories. Either Prewitt had been tipped off by someone inside the investigation, inside the contractor community, or through some channel they hadn't identified. Or he was simply being cautious for independent reasons. A routine security briefing at MacDill. A polygraph scheduled. Personal anxiety. The problem was, they couldn't know which it was without risking exposure. The solution was a calculated pause. For 19 days, Marsh made no contact with Carver. No pressure, no follow-up. If Prewitt had gone dark out of caution, any external pressure on the network at that moment could confirm his suspicions. The operation waited. On January 28th, Prewitt reemerged. A wire transfer of $31,000 from the Latvian intermediary. The silence had been personal caution, nothing more. The undercover relationship between Marsh and Carver deepened through February and March. Marsh was introduced, cautiously, over weeks of gradual trust building, to Vasquez. Prewitt remained one layer removed, communicating with the network through Carver as an intermediary rather than directly. Investigators noted this structural separation. Prewitt appeared to be the most operationally cautious of the three. What Marsh was being offered, piece by piece, was a tiered access arrangement. Carver and Vasquez had the data. Marsh, as a fourth contractor, was being positioned as an additional distribution node, someone who could pass information to the Dubai broker through a separate channel, providing redundancy and deniability. The arrangement also gave the network a way to expand its access profile. Marsh's cover identity came with a plausible credential set that, in the fiction, included access to different contract vehicles than Carver or Vasquez held. The broker, Al-Rashid, operating through Nexus Advisory Group, never appeared in Tampa. All communication ran through encrypted messaging applications and voice-over IP calls that routed through servers in Cyprus and the UAE. But investigators were building a map. What's most surprising about this case isn't the money. $47,000 per transfer sounds like a lot until you consider what was being sold. The fuel resupply schedules and maintenance windows for U.S. Navy vessels operating in one of the most contested maritime corridors on Earth during an active naval standoff had a strategic value that dwarfed the dollar amounts changing hands. The Iranians were paying retail for wholesale intelligence. The real question isn't what they paid, it's what they did with it. Treasury's OFAC had already designated the broader network associated with Al-Rashid's procurement activities in February 2026, a formal sanctions action against 4 Gulf-registered entities connected to Iranian intelligence procurement. Nexus Advisory Group was not among them. Either OFAC didn't have enough to move on Nexus yet, or the decision was made deliberately to leave Nexus operating so the Tampa investigation could continue building its case without triggering the network's termination. Investigators later confirmed it was the latter. OFAC had been coordinating with FBI and NCIS since November 2025. The February designations were surgical, close enough to Nexus to demonstrate action, far enough to leave the Tampa thread intact. Here's the take that'll probably get us some pushback. The decision to leave the Nexus channel operating for another 4 months after the OFAC action, knowing that real naval intelligence was still flowing through the pipeline to Iranian-linked recipients, deserves scrutiny. 4 months of continued intelligence exposure in exchange for a stronger criminal case. Whether that trade was worth it is a legitimate question the public record doesn't fully answer. The second operational obstacle came in March 2026, and it was more dangerous than the first. Elena Vasquez requested a meeting with Carver that surveillance captured on March 11th. The audio was partial, a parking garage, ambient noise interference. But what came through was clear enough. Vasquez was nervous. She'd been approached by a colleague at MacDill about a renewed security awareness briefing focused specifically on insider threat indicators. The briefing was routine, a counterintelligence training requirement that cycled through MacDill's contractor population on a rolling basis. But the timing, coming 2 weeks after the OFAC designations, had rattled her. She told Carver she wanted to stop, or at least pause. Carver talked her down. The conversation lasted 23 minutes. By the end, Vasquez had agreed to continue. But the exchange had given investigators something they hadn't had before. Vasquez, on tape, discussing the scheme's existence in explicit enough terms to constitute a significant evidentiary piece. The second obstacle had handed them a gift. What do you think? Was the decision to keep these contractors in place and the intelligence pipeline open the right call, or did the institutional interest in building a clean criminal case take priority over real-time national security? It's a question worth sitting with. By April 2026, the evidentiary picture was reaching the threshold that federal prosecutors needed. Recorded communications, documented wire transfers totaling, across all 3 defendants, $4, $7 million over 11 months. Digital forensics, obtained through court-authorized access to devices connected to the scheme, showing a pattern of data access that correlated directly with subsequent wire transfer activity. and Marsh's operational logs meticulously documented in real time, providing a coherent narrative of how the recruitment and distribution network functioned. There was one detail in the forensic analysis that stuck with me. A single encrypted thumb drive recovered from Vasquez's home computer during a court-authorized search in April showed file access timestamps that were systematically offset by 47 minutes from the standard MacDill network logging times. Someone had adjusted the system clock on the device before accessing the files. The adjustment was consistent across multiple sessions, a deliberate counter-forensics technique indicating a level of operational sophistication beyond what the initial investigation had assumed. It meant Vasquez, at least, had been coached. Someone had given her specific instructions for how to move data without leaving a clean timestamp trail. That someone was almost certainly al-Rashid, or a technical resource operating through his network. It also raised a question the investigation hadn't yet answered. Were there other nodes in the Tampa access chain that hadn't been identified? Was the cell of 3 actually larger? The third obstacle arrived in May 2026, 6 weeks before the arrests, and it came from inside the investigation itself. A sealed court filing related to the digital forensics component of the case was, through a clerical error in the federal court's electronic filing system, briefly accessible in a public docket search before a court administrator caught and corrected the mistake. The filing was online for less than 4 hours. It contained no names, no specific operational details, but it referenced an ongoing Tampa area federal counterintelligence investigation involving defense contractor access to classified naval logistics data. 4 hours, then gone. The question was whether anyone had seen it, whether al-Rashid's network or anyone connected to it had been monitoring federal court filings for exactly this kind of exposure. Investigators ran a digital access log on the filing's court-generated URL. 11 external IP addresses had accessed it during the 4-hour window. 7 resolved to news aggregation bots. 3 resolved to law firm research services. 1 resolved to a VPN exit node in Cyprus. The same routing jurisdiction used for the encrypted voice-over IP calls between Tampa and al-Rashid's network. The lead agent on the Tampa task force, FBI Supervisory Special Agent Patricia Holloway, made the call within 12 hours, moved the arrest date forward. The original timeline had targeted late June. Holloway pushed it to June 3rd, 9 days of compressed preparation. The surveillance teams intensified. The evidence packaging accelerated. Prosecutors signed off on final warrant applications over a 4-day period that, by the accounts of those involved, produced very little sleep. The one remaining piece. The final confirmation that would anchor the case against all 3 defendants simultaneously was the June 1st wire transfer. $83,000, routed through the Latvian intermediary to Carver's account, with a matching smaller transfer of $27,000 to a secondary account investigators had identified as connected to Vasquez. Prewitt's share had been structured differently. A payment to a real estate LLC he held with a family member, recorded as a consulting retainer. Investigators had been tracking that vehicle for 3 months. The June 1st transfers cleared at 2:14 p.m. Eastern Time. By 4 p.m., the arrest warrants were finalized. By midnight, the operational briefing for the 3 arrest teams had been completed. At 5:47 a.m. on June 3rd, 2026, the columns moved. The first team reached Carver's home in a residential neighborhood in Brandon at 5:49 a.m. The approach was standard. 2 vehicles in front, one blocking the alley behind the property, agents in body armor at the front and rear doors simultaneously. Carver answered the door in a Tampa Bay Buccaneers t-shirt. He said nothing for the first 12 seconds after the agents identified themselves and stated the purpose of the arrest. Then he asked, quietly, if he could put on shoes. He was in custody by 5:52 a.m. The second team reached Prewitt's apartment complex in New Tampa at 5:51 a.m. Prewitt's unit was on the 3rd floor. 4 agents took the stairwell, 2 took the elevator. When the agents knocked, there was a 17-second pause before Prewitt opened the door. He was already dressed. Investigators later noted that Prewitt's phone, recovered from his kitchen counter, showed a browser open to an international flight search. The most recent search, departure from Tampa International, June 5th. Destination, Istanbul. He had 2 days. The third team reached Vasquez's home in South Tampa at 5:53 a.m. The arrest was unremarkable. Vasquez did not resist. She made no statements at the scene. Her attorney was called within 20 minutes of the arrest. Simultaneous with the 3 arrests, a 4th team executed a search warrant at the Riverview boat storage facility where financial surveillance had identified a unit rented under a business name connected to Carver. Inside, $218,000 in banded cash, an encrypted thumb drive, A burner phone, a prepaid device with 340 outgoing messages to a number that traced to a UAE-registered SIM associated with al-Rashid's communications pattern, and a sealed envelope containing a handwritten list of what investigators described in the subsequent affidavit as access categories and corresponding data types available through the MacDill contract environment. In plain language, a product menu. What data was available, broken down by category, with implicit pricing. Search warrants executed simultaneously at all three defendants' residences and office spaces recovered additional digital evidence. External hard drives, additional encrypted storage devices, and in Vasquez's case, a second laptop that had not been connected to any known network during the investigation. A machine that forensic analysis later confirmed had been used to compile the aggregated operational summaries before transfer. The encrypted drives from Riverview were processed through FBI's Digital Forensics Unit in Quantico. The communications data on the burner phone, 340 outgoing messages, spanning from July 2025 through May 2026, provided a near-complete operational log of the scheme's communications architecture. The messages didn't use operational language. The network had developed a simple substitution code. Maintenance schedules referred to as service calendars, transit corridors as delivery routes, vessel repositioning orders as schedule updates. The code wasn't sophisticated. It wasn't designed to defeat serious cryptographic analysis. It was designed to look, to a casual reader, like routine logistics coordination. What made it effective for 11 months wasn't the code. It was the institutional assumption that the people sending the messages were who their clearances said they were. Here's what this case tells us about the security architecture around contractor access in large defense installations. The system is built on a credential model that works well against external threats and badly against inside actors who understand the logging environment. Carver, Prewitt, and Vasquez didn't hack anything. They didn't defeat any technical security measure. They accessed data they were authorized to access, moved it through channels that looked like normal administrative behavior, and passed it to a network that had the patience to wait for payments to accumulate without drawing attention. The vulnerability wasn't technical, it was structural. And it had been sitting inside the MacDill contractor ecosystem for at least 11 months before Sandra Yee, in Norfolk, looking at a distribution list for a single repositioning order, noticed that something didn't add up. Will this happen again? Comment why yes or no, because the structural conditions that made this possible, contractor access to sensitive logistics data distributed across multiple subcontractors with varying clearance profiles, with access logging that assumes good faith. Those conditions exist at dozens of installations across the country. The cell in Tampa is dismantled. The architecture that made it possible is largely unchanged. All three defendants were presented in federal court on June 4th, 2026. Each was charged under 18 U.S.C., Section 794. The Espionage Act provision covering transmission of national defense information to a foreign government or agent thereof. And under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, specifically the sanctions evasion provisions related to the Iranian-linked network. Additional charges included conspiracy and money laundering. Prosecutors moved to detain all three defendants pending trial, citing flight risk. The motion for Prewitt was unopposed by his defense counsel, given the Istanbul flight search recovered from his phone. The government's detention memo, filed publicly in the Southern District of Florida, described the case as one of the most operationally damaging naval intelligence leaks tied to the Iran conflict in the period following the Hormuz blockade's initiation. It noted that the intelligence pipeline had been active during a period when at least 3 U.S. Navy vessels had altered their transit schedules, and that investigators were still assessing whether Iranian patrol behavior during specific incidents in the Strait during late 2025 and early 2026 could be attributed in part to the data flow from Tampa. That assessment, the operational damage assessment, had not been completed by the time of the arrests. Its findings have not been made public. Farouk al-Rashid remains at large. Nexus Advisory Group was formally designated by OFAC on June 4, 2026, the day after the arrests. Al-Rashid's last confirmed location was the UAE. Extradition arrangements between the United States and the UAE exist, but have historically produced inconsistent results in cases involving financial crimes and intelligence activity. Al-Rashid has not been seen at any of his known Dubai addresses since late May 2026. The Latvian intermediary bank, Meridian Capital Services, had its correspondent banking relationships with U.S. financial institutions suspended by regulatory action on June 10, 2026. The suspension froze accounts connected to the Tampa transactions. Of the $4, $7 million documented as paid through the network. Investigators confirmed recovery of $218,000 from the Riverview storage unit and approximately $340,000 across various financial accounts seized under court orders. The remainder, more than $4, $1 million, has not been recovered. Subscribe to Case Zero. The full picture on what the operational damage assessment eventually concludes, if it's ever made public, is a story we'll cover when the documents become available. Sandra Yee received a commendation from NCIS leadership for the anomaly flag that initiated the case. The commendation is classified. Her name appears in the public record only because it was referenced in a footnote to the federal detention memo, a detail that her supervisors reportedly did not intend to be included in the public filing. One footnote, in a document that almost no one reads. That's how 11 months of Iranian naval intelligence started unwinding. The network is dismantled. The access conditions that made it possible are still in place. And somewhere between Cyprus and Dubai, the man who ran the money is not in custody.